Karoline Leavitt strode into the packed courtroom with a calm but determined demeanor, her eyes scanning the room as she prepared for what would surely be the most pivotal moment of her political career. The case before them was unlike any other, a challenge to an overreaching judicial decision made by a judge appointed during the Obama administration. The stakes were higher than ever, and the nation was watching. Leavitt was no stranger to pressure. As one of the youngest and most brilliant political minds in Congress, she had earned a reputation for her sharp wit and unwavering tenacity. Today, she would need all of that, and more. The judge, a towering figure in legal circles, had ruled on several controversial cases over the years. His reputation for siding with progressive causes had made him a hero to some and a villain to others. But Karoline saw his decisions for what they were, politically driven, often disregarding the law in favor of personal ideology. She knew this was her moment to shine, to dismantle the carefully constructed narrative the judge had built over the years. The tension in the air was palpable. As Karoline stepped forward to make her argument, she couldn't help but notice the judge's self-assured smirk. He was used to being in control, to holding the power. Today, though, he would face someone who wasn't afraid to take that control away from him. "Your Honor," Karoline began, her voice steady and unwavering, "you have been entrusted with a great responsibility, and yet your rulings often seem to favor partisan ideals over the constitutionally grounded principles that should guide us all." The judge's brow furrowed slightly, but he remained silent. Karoline could feel the eyes of the room on her. This was her chance to strike first. With surgical precision, she continued, dismantling his previous rulings one by one. She highlighted the inconsistencies, the biases, the apparent disregard for constitutional protections. Each argument was met with a tense silence from the judge, who could feel the walls closing in on him. The audience, mostly legal experts and political insiders, watched with bated breath. This was not just a legal battle, it was a political one. Karoline was playing a game that few dared to play. She wasn't just questioning the judge's decisions, she was questioning the very foundation of his authority. As the tension mounted, the judge finally broke his silence, his voice low but filled with authority. "You are challenging not just my rulings but the judicial system itself," he said, his eyes narrowing. "You're out of your depth, young lady." Karoline smiled, unfazed by his attempt to intimidate her. "No, Your Honor," she replied coolly, "I'm simply reminding you that power must always be held accountable, even in the hallowed halls of justice." And with that, the first volley had been fired. The courtroom was now an arena of intense silence. Karoline could feel the weight of the moment in her chest, her pulse steady despite the mounting tension. The judge's attempt to undermine her had been expected, and her response was a calculated move. She had made it clear that this wasn't just about the law, it was about the principles on which this country stood. The judge, however, wasn't one to be rattled easily. His sharp mind and experience in the legal world had made him a formidable opponent, and he was known for his quick wit. Yet, Karoline had prepared for this moment far in advance. She knew that to win, she needed more than just logical arguments. She needed to expose the cracks in the system, to turn the judge's own methods against him. With her next move, Karoline shifted tactics. She had come equipped with a masterful play, something the judge hadn't anticipated, an ironclad piece of evidence that would make even the most seasoned legal minds question the judge's impartiality. "Your Honor," she said, standing tall and locking eyes with the judge, "I'd like to submit into evidence Exhibit A, the judge's previous rulings on similar cases. All of these, without exception, have been overturned on appeal." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge's face tightened. It was clear he hadn't expected this level of precision from his adversary. Karoline had carefully researched his rulings, pinpointing his most controversial decisions that had been struck down by higher courts. Leavitt presented each case with the same meticulous detail, pointing out how his rulings had consistently veered into politically motivated territory, undermining the integrity of the justice system. "Your Honor, you were appointed to serve as an impartial guardian of the law," she continued, her voice unwavering. "But time and time again, you've allowed your personal beliefs to override your duty to the Constitution. The judge shifted in his seat, his previously composed demeanor cracking ever so slightly. He leaned forward, clearly on the defensive now, but Karoline wasn't finished. She knew this moment was about to turn the tide in her favor. As you well know, Karoline continued, our legal system is built on the idea that the law must be blind to politics. And yet, you've allowed your ideology to shape your rulings. The evidence here today makes it impossible to ignore. Your personal biases have led to judicial overreach, and the public trust in your objectivity is compromised. The courtroom was now on edge, the tension rising with every word Karoline spoke. She had placed the judge in a precarious position, forced to defend not just his decisions, but his very integrity. The judge opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, he hesitated. The weight of Karoline's argument was taking its toll. The subtle but powerful jab had landed. Karoline could feel the momentum shift in her favor, the audience sensing the vulnerability in the judge's posture. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about dismantling the very foundation of a judicial figure who had long been seen as untouchable. Your Honor, Karoline said with quiet confidence, I don't believe this is just about you or me. This is about the integrity of our entire system. I urge you to reconsider your position and do what is right for the American people, not what serves a political agenda. The judge's expression hardened as he realized the gravity of the situation. The power dynamic had shifted. Karoline had played her hand perfectly. The judge sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping the surface of the desk nervously. For the first time in what had undoubtedly been a long and distinguished career, he was unsure of his next move. The room, once buzzing with the usual legal formality, Karoline Leavitt's calculated assault had left its mark. For a moment, it seemed as though the judge might regain his composure, deliver a stern rebuttal, and return to his usual commanding presence. But Karoline wasn't done. She knew that now was the time to go in for the kill. Your Honor, she began, her tone steady and almost too calm for such a high-stakes moment, I think it's important we all recognize that this case goes far beyond any one individual's career. This is about the future of our courts, the sanctity of our Constitution, and the very trust Americans place in those who are tasked with upholding it. Her voice rose, a quiet but undeniable power in her words. The judge looked at her, and for the briefest moment, she saw something flicker behind his eyes, perhaps regret, or more likely, the first inklings of defeat. Perhaps, she said, leaning forward slightly, you have forgotten what it means to be impartial. Or maybe you've convinced yourself that your personal beliefs somehow serve the greater good. Karoline paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. But today, we aren't here to defend a person. We're here to defend the law. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom, the crowd sensing the turning tide. Karoline had carefully navigated this case not just with evidence, but with an understanding of the larger political implications. She wasn't merely trying to win a case, she was dismantling the very notion that the judicial branch could be so easily manipulated for ideological purposes. The judge, visibly flustered now, cleared his throat. His usual stoic confidence seemed to be slipping. But Karoline knew that he would try to recover, to salvage his image in front of the public. His next words would be critical, and she was ready for whatever he threw at her. Ms. Leavitt, the judge began, his voice strained, you've made your arguments. But I assure you, I've followed the law in every instance. These accusations of bias are unfounded and dangerous. To question my integrity is to undermine the very fabric of our judicial system. Karoline leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. No, Your Honor. What's dangerous is allowing someone to sit on the bench who believes their political leanings can override the rule of law. She held his gaze firmly, unflinching. What's dangerous is that you've used the power of your office to push a political agenda, and for years, no one has had the courage to hold you accountable. She knew she had him now. I'm not here to dismantle the judiciary, Karoline said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. I'm here to remind everyone in this room, especially you, that the law is not a tool to be wielded by those who think their personal ideology is above reproach. The American people deserve better than that. The judge's face had turned a shade of red, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He was visibly shaken, a far cry from the commanding figure he had been at the start of this hearing. Karoline's final blow came next, and it was one the judge had never seen coming. She stood up, slowly, making her way to the center of the courtroom. With a dramatic pause, she turned to face the gallery of spectators, many of whom had been leaning in, captivated by her every word. "Let me make one thing clear," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just about me defeating you in this case. It's about making sure that no judge, no politician, no one in power ever forgets that they are held accountable to the people. The law is not their playground, and their actions will not go unchecked." The room was silent. The weight of her words hung in the air like a thick fog, and it was clear that the judge, once an unshakable pillar of the judicial establishment, had been thoroughly rattled. With a final glance toward the judge, Karoline calmly turned and made her way back to her seat. The game had been won. But the consequences would be felt long after this courtroom session was over. Outside, the media was already gathering, waiting to report on the stunning shift in the political landscape. Karoline Leavitt had done what few had dared to do. She had dismantled a powerful figure, exposed the cracks in the judicial system, and emerged victorious. And as the doors of the courtroom swung open, it was clear to everyone that this was only the beginning of her fight. The days following Karoline Leavitt's stunning courtroom victory were nothing short of chaotic. Media outlets were abuzz with coverage, analyzing every moment of the dramatic showdown. Political pundits debated the ramifications of her daring assault on the judicial system, with many calling it the most calculated and effective political move of her career. But while the media circled like vultures, Karoline stayed focused. She wasn't in this for the headlines or the praise, she was in this for the long haul, for the fight that lay ahead. Her office was flooded with calls and messages of congratulations from allies, but also from critics who feared the consequences of her challenge to the judiciary. There were whispers, too, of political opponents who were already scrambling to capitalize on her move, questioning her methods and branding her as reckless. But Karoline knew better than to worry about their noise. In Washington, political attacks were inevitable, they came with the territory. What mattered now was what came next. The judge, although wounded, was far from finished. His position on the bench was under scrutiny, and Karoline knew that the ripple effect of her actions had only just begun. The media had already latched onto the story, spinning it into a narrative that was larger than the courtroom itself. In the days following the trial, calls for an investigation into the judge's previous rulings came from multiple political corners. Opponents of the administration were quick to rally behind Karoline's arguments, while those loyal to the judge and his legacy tried to downplay her success, claiming she had overstepped. One evening, Karoline sat at her desk in her office, a glass of water in front of her, watching the news. The ticker on the bottom of the screen flashed headlines about her courtroom victory, but they also showed a growing storm of resistance forming against her. She had expected this. What had started as a legal battle was now morphing into a political one, and the fallout was bound to be intense. She sat back in her chair, considering her next move. It was clear that some were trying to make her out to be a political extremist, pushing a partisan agenda that was out of line with the values of the nation's legal system. But Karoline wasn't the type to let others define her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her chief of staff, urgent. "There's a meeting with the Speaker of the House tomorrow. They want to discuss the aftermath of the case. The fallout is becoming more serious. You'll need to prepare for tough questions." Karoline sighed. She had anticipated this, but it still stung. She wasn't just challenging a judge, she was challenging a system that many believed was untouchable. If she wasn't careful, this could set her back politically. Yet, in her gut, she knew she had made the right call. Her instincts had led her this far, and they had proven themselves time and time again. The next morning, Karoline entered the meeting with the Speaker's office, her team in tow. The room was filled with heavyweights, congressional leaders, advisors, and the speaker himself, a seasoned politician who had seen and heard it all. "You've certainly stirred the pot, Karoline," the speaker said, his tone a mix of admiration and caution. "But we need to be careful here. You've taken on a giant. The judge, despite his controversies, has allies who will fight back hard. If we're not strategic, we risk alienating key parts of the judiciary." Karoline met his gaze, unwavering. "I didn't do this to make friends. I did it because the system is broken. We can't afford to wait around for the next scandal, the next overreach. If we want real change, we have to take bold steps." The speaker leaned forward, folding his hands. "I understand your passion, but this is bigger than any one person. We need to have the right legislative framework in place to back up what you've done. Otherwise, we risk looking like we're playing a political game rather than standing on principle." The conversation continued, but Karoline could feel the pressure mounting. She knew the speaker was right, this couldn't just be a momentary victory. She needed to build the groundwork for lasting change, to turn the tides of public opinion, and to solidify her role as a defender of the law. By the time the meeting ended, Karoline had a new sense of clarity. The battle she had fought in the courtroom was just the opening act. The real work, passing new reforms, holding more figures accountable, shifting the political narrative, was yet to come. She walked out of the building, the crisp air outside a stark contrast to the heated discussions she had just left. As she made her way back to her office, she couldn't help but think about the long road ahead. But Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to a challenge. She had taken on a powerful judge, and she had won. Now, she would take on the system itself. The game had only just begun. Karoline's victory in the courtroom had set off a firestorm. Within days, she was the talk of every major news network, praised by some, vilified by others. What had begun as a calculated legal move had escalated into a full-blown political crisis, and Karoline had quickly learned that nothing in Washington, D.C., ever comes without a price. The media coverage was relentless. On one side, conservative outlets hailed her as a hero, someone who had taken down a rogue judge who had consistently ruled from a left-wing perspective. On the other side, liberal media outlets denounced her as a dangerous provocateur who was more interested in dismantling the judiciary for political gain than in upholding the rule of law. Some even questioned her motives, suggesting that she was using the case as a stepping stone for her own political ambitions. A particularly scathing editorial in the Washington Post labeled her the reckless rising star of the far right, and warned that her rise to power threatened to destabilize the delicate balance of the judicial system. Despite the intense scrutiny, Karoline refused to back down. She had expected the attacks, and in a way, they only solidified her resolve. But it wasn't just the media she had to contend with, there were also whispers in the halls of Congress. Some of her colleagues, particularly those from moderate or left-leaning districts, began to distance themselves from her. They feared that her bold move would alienate voters and make it harder to pass the legislation they needed. A week after the courtroom showdown, Karoline stood before a small, closed-door meeting with her closest allies. The conference room was quiet, but the tension in the air was thick. Her political team was split, some advising her to double down, others suggesting that she might have overplayed her hand. They all knew that the next move was crucial. "We've got a real fight ahead of us," said Mark, her communications director. "The left is already mobilizing against you. We're seeing more calls for your censure, and we've got several Democratic senators talking about a full investigation into your conduct. If they push it to the floor, we'll need more than just support from the right to hold this together." Karoline nodded. "I didn't go after the judge just to score political points. This is bigger than that. The people need to know we're not afraid to hold the system accountable. But we also need to be strategic about how we move forward." Her chief of staff, Anna, spoke up. "We need to start framing the conversation around reform. This isn't just about a single judge anymore. It's about ensuring that judges, no matter their political leanings, follow the law. We can't let this get bogged down in partisan rhetoric." Karoline leaned back in her chair, considering the options. She knew Anna was right. This was no longer just a personal vendetta against one judge. If she was going to succeed in pushing her vision for a more accountable judiciary, she needed to rally the public and make this about reform, not just retribution. "The public is with us on this," Karoline said, her voice steady. "We've seen the polls. People are tired of a system where judges can act with impunity. This is the moment to push for real change." Mark spoke up again. "We can't underestimate the backlash. The left is already working on their counter-narrative. They're framing this as an attack on judicial independence. We need to beat them at their own game." Karoline smiled. "I've already got a plan." Later that afternoon, Karoline's office issued a statement that would shift the focus of the debate. The statement was bold, direct, and perfectly crafted to turn the narrative around. It wasn't about the judge anymore, it was about the people. The American people deserve a judicial system that is impartial, transparent, and, most importantly, accountable. My decision to challenge a judge's overreach was not a partisan move, it was a stand for the integrity of the law. I will continue to fight for reforms that ensure our judges are held to the highest standards and that justice is truly blind to political ideologies. I'm committed to working with both sides of the aisle to make sure our courts serve the people, not political agendas. The statement was a masterstroke, reframing the debate in a way that made it harder for her critics to call her actions purely partisan. Karoline had successfully positioned herself as a reformer, someone who cared deeply about the integrity of the judicial system, and she was no longer just defending her actions, she was pushing forward with a broader legislative agenda. The reaction was swift. Conservative circles erupted in praise, with pundits across the spectrum echoing Karoline's message of judicial accountability. But on the other side, the left wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. A few days after the statement, the House Judiciary Committee announced it would begin an investigation into her actions. The headlines were quick to follow: House Judiciary to investigate Karoline Leavitt's role in undermining the judiciary. It was clear the battle was far from over, but Karoline was ready. She had anticipated this move. She knew the fight would get ugly. But now, with the support of the public behind her and a carefully crafted plan in motion, Karoline was determined to win, not just the courtroom battle, but the war for judicial reform. The real test was just beginning, and this time, she wasn't going to let anyone stop her. As the investigation into Karoline Leavitt's actions began to take shape, the political landscape became even more polarized. The House Judiciary Committee's decision to formally look into her conduct was both a sign of the fierce resistance she was facing and an opportunity for her to solidify her position as a leader unafraid to take on the establishment. The media frenzy around the investigation was in full swing. News outlets from both ends of the political spectrum were spinning the story in different directions. On the left, Karoline was being painted as a rogue politician who had taken law into her own hands, jeopardizing the judicial system for political clout. On the right, she was still hailed as a champion of judicial integrity, a brave patriot willing to stand up against an unchecked system. Behind closed doors, Karoline's team was strategizing, and their plan was as ambitious as it was calculated. The investigation into her actions wasn't just a political inconvenience, it was an opportunity to gain more ground. If she could turn this into a broader debate about judicial reforms, she could further her agenda and come out ahead. Karoline gathered her closest allies once again, this time in a strategy meeting at her Capitol Hill office. The stakes were higher now, as pressure mounted from both her supporters and detractors. The committee's investigation could drag on for months, and Karoline needed to ensure that the narrative stayed in her control. "We need to spin this," said Mark, her communications director, as he passed around a briefing document. "We can't let this investigation dominate the headlines. We need to refocus the discussion on judicial accountability. Let's put the pressure back on the judges, not on you. The public is on your side, they want reform, not a drawn-out political circus." Karoline nodded, her expression steely. "I agree. We'll use this investigation to showcase the need for judicial oversight. We'll turn it into a broader campaign for transparency in the judicial system. The investigation won't hurt us, it'll only help us gain more support." Her chief of staff, Anna, was quick to add, "We'll need to get ahead of the left's narrative. They're going to try and frame this as an attack on the judiciary. If we let them set the terms of the debate, we lose control. We need to remind the public that this isn't about one judge, it's about ensuring that no judge is above the law." As the conversation continued, Karoline's mind was already racing ahead, formulating the next move. She knew that, for now, she had to be patient. The hearings wouldn't begin for weeks, but when they did, she would be ready. It wasn't just about defending herself, it was about putting the judiciary on trial. Later that week, Karoline appeared before the press, her composure flawless. The cameras flashed as she took her place at the podium, ready to speak. She knew this was an opportunity to reshape the narrative before it spiraled out of her control. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and direct, "there is an attack on our judicial system happening right now, but it's not from me. It's from those who would rather protect a broken system than allow for the kind of change that the American people so desperately need." The press pool shifted, cameras tracking her every movement. Karoline had done this before, she knew how to control the room, how to speak directly to the public while keeping her critics at bay. "The investigation into my actions," she continued, "is nothing more than a diversion from the real issue, the unchecked power that certain judges have wielded for far too long. This isn't about one judge, this is about a system that has allowed personal bias and political ideology to influence rulings that affect every American." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The time has come for accountability, for reform. And I will not back down. We will ensure that the judicial system is transparent, impartial, and held to the highest standards." Her words hung in the air, powerful and unyielding. The room fell silent for a moment as reporters scribbled down notes, processing her stance. Karoline had reframed the situation yet again. Now, it wasn't just about the judge or her actions, it was about the need for systemic change, for judicial reform that transcended partisan divides. As the press conference concluded, Karoline walked away with the sense that she had made a significant impact. The backlash against her was fierce, but so was the growing support. Public opinion was starting to shift in her favor. Her poll numbers had surged, and her calls for reform were resonating with a growing number of Americans who felt the system needed a major overhaul. But even as the momentum built, Karoline knew she couldn't afford to get complacent. The left would continue to fight back, and the investigation was far from over. She had made her case, but now it was time to push for action. In the following weeks, Karoline used her growing platform to push for specific reforms, transparent judicial hearings, stronger ethical standards for judges, and mechanisms for holding judges accountable when they overstep their bounds. She introduced bills in the House that would serve as the foundation for her broader vision of a reformed judiciary. Meanwhile, the investigation into her actions continued, but Karoline was undeterred. She had turned the tables on her critics, taking what was meant to be a political weapon against her and using it as a rallying cry for the change she believed in. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the integrity of the system and the future of the country's courts. As the weeks passed and the battle escalated, it was clear that Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a rising star in politics, she was a force to be reckoned with. And in Washington, that kind of power was something no one could ignore. The battle had raged on for months. Karoline Leavitt, once a rising star, had become a central figure in the national conversation. The investigation into her actions was nearing its final stages, but her influence had only grown stronger. What had started as a courtroom showdown with a rogue judge had turned into a full-scale political movement, shaking the very foundations of the judicial system. As the investigation's conclusion loomed, Karoline knew she had to make her final move. The public was watching. Her allies were waiting. Her opponents were growing desperate. The time for half measures was over. She had already shifted the narrative, now, she needed to ensure that the reforms she championed would become reality. One evening, As Karoline sat in her office reviewing the final drafts of the judicial reform bills she had worked so tirelessly on, her chief of staff, Anna, entered the room with a solemn expression. "Karoline," she said, "we've received word from the committee. They're about to release their findings. The investigation is likely to be harsh. The left is pushing hard for censure, and they're expecting a public apology from you." Karoline's gaze didn't waver as she looked up. "Let them. They won't get it." Anna paused. "Are you sure? This could affect your political future." Karoline stood, her voice calm but filled with determination. "I'm not here to make political calculations. I'm here to make change. This investigation was never about me, it was about a broken system. They can't silence me, and they won't stop us." The next day, Karoline appeared before the press once again. The moment was pivotal. Her political future, her entire campaign for reform, hung in the balance. The committee's findings were about to be released, and the pressure was mounting from all sides. The room was packed with reporters. Cameras flashed, and the air was thick with anticipation. Karoline took her place at the podium, her eyes steady and resolute. She knew what they expected from her, but she would not play by their rules. "Today, I stand before you not as someone under investigation, but as a leader who has committed herself to making our judicial system better, stronger, and more accountable," she began, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I was challenged for doing what was right. I was attacked for questioning a system that has allowed political ideologies to dictate rulings rather than impartial justice. But let me be clear, this investigation is not about me. This is about the millions of Americans who feel their voices are being silenced by a judiciary that has lost its way." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "I will not apologize for taking a stand. I will not back down from calling for reform. The truth is simple, our courts must be fair, our judges must be impartial, and the rule of law must always come before political agendas." Her words were a rallying cry, one that resonated with many who had been quietly waiting for a leader to take a stand against a system that seemed to favor the powerful. Karoline continued, emphasizing the need for real, tangible reforms. "We must implement judicial transparency, strengthen ethical standards, and establish oversight that holds judges accountable when they overstep. These are not radical ideas, they are the foundation of a functioning democracy. And I will fight for them every single day." As she spoke, the reaction in the room was palpable. Some reporters jotted down notes, others exchanged looks of surprise. The left, expecting an apology, was left speechless. Karoline had reframed the entire debate once again. This was no longer just about her, this was a movement. The committee's final report was released hours later, as expected. It recommended that Karoline's actions be scrutinized and that the political pressure surrounding her be taken into account. It was a harsh critique, but it lacked the forceful censure many had hoped for. The report acknowledged her concerns about judicial reform but criticized her methods. However, the political fallout was nowhere near as severe as her critics had anticipated. Karoline's public address had shifted the debate. While there were still loud voices condemning her, the narrative was no longer about her challenging a single judge, it was about the need for change in the system itself. In the weeks that followed, Karoline's bills for judicial reform gained momentum. Her coalition of supporters grew, crossing party lines. Moderate Republicans, some Democrats, and independents rallied behind her cause. Public pressure mounted, and soon enough, a broad coalition was forming in Congress to pass sweeping judicial reforms. The final vote came in the early hours of a summer morning, the chambers filled with both anticipation and skepticism. Karoline stood in the back of the room, her heart pounding as the roll call began. The reforms she had fought for, transparent judicial hearings, stronger ethical guidelines for judges, and mechanisms for holding judges accountable, were all on the line. When the final vote was tallied, the reforms passed with a solid majority. Karoline had won. As the results were announced, Karoline allowed herself a moment to savor the victory. This wasn't just about her, it was about the millions of Americans who had stood behind her and demanded a better, more accountable system. She walked out of the Capitol, her head held high, the weight of the past months lifting. She had come into this fight as an underdog, and she had emerged victorious. But more importantly, she had redefined what it meant to challenge the status quo. The battle was over, but the war for judicial reform had just begun. And Karoline Leavitt had proven that, with enough resolve, even the most entrenched systems could be changed.